Dominic Davies, hello.
Hello, David. How are you?
Good. Thanks for talking to me this morning. It's 8:30 in the morning, which is our normal coffee and breakfast time, which we used to have. I missed that.
I really miss those two. Yeah, eggs Benedict and latte, as I recall.
Uh,
Oh, that's the parrot. That's the parrot joining in. Yes, don't worry about the
More the
parrot.
merrier. So for the listeners, Dominic Davies, I know him as my breakfast companion, but also a brilliant therapist, very, very kind. And I associate you with Pink Therapy. Can you please give us a very proud introduction of your history of qualifications of what you do?
Okay. I've been working with the queer community for nearly 40 years. I started when I was quite a confused young man in my early 20s. I set up Pink Therapy 21 years ago, which is the largest independent therapy organization in the UK. So it's private therapists. And we've now run some international training programs online for therapists around the world who want to know more about what we now call gender, sex, and relationship diverse clients. So it goes beyond LGBTIQQA++, because it also includes kink and various other things. So I'll use the word queer in this context to mean any of these people who sit outside cisgender, heteronormativity, mononormativity, these kinds of things, the interesting people in life. That's going to get me some trouble, but you know what I mean.
I do, and I agree with you. I adore this community too, and I find this a very interesting world to live in. And it's also a really important thing that Pink Therapy exists, because obviously in the chemsex communities around the world that I kind of support need culturally competent, queer aware, diverse aware, kink aware support. And that's what Pink Therapy is. It's by definition, this is what it is. Can you take me back to why you set it up, those early days?
Well, I co-edited the first three British textbooks. So the first one came out in 1996, right in the midst of the AIDS pandemic. And then we had two more books that came out in the year 2000. And they really put, before then, the gay affirmative therapy in the UK or queer affirmative therapy in the UK was not on the agenda, really. There were a few individuals working in their own private practices or working in NGOs, mostly as volunteers, and it didn't really exist as a field. Since then, and since I formed Pink Therapy, now we have lots of specialists, what might be called GSRD, counsellors or therapists, around the UK and indeed in parts of the world, who are doing specialist work with their communities, with these kind of very diverse communities. And so, yeah, now, 21 years later, a field exists, a new field of psychology and sexology exists. And some of that, I mean, in the States, it was happening as well, but I kind of did Britain and to some extent Europe. I kind of helped put it on the map. I mean, there was a few other people involved as well, but I kind of, the books, I think, kind of built something. Yeah.
Pink Therapy gave me my very first paid opportunity to do training decades ago.
Really?
Yeah, and I was really
well,
didn't see myself as
we were very lucky to have you. And I'm very grateful for your knowledge, because you've got so much experience in this area. We wanted the best.
That's kind, but at the time, you know how volunteers and services are like, they're just sort of used and rolled out. And you just came along and said, well, you're experienced and you're knowledgeable and you deserve to be paid for what you're doing. And you're my first. I know.
Good.
Breakfast on me for the rest of your life. Pink Therapy, it is an amazing, it's one of the landmarks in our LGBTQ history, I think, and it's really been a lifesaver for some people that have found themselves sitting in front of therapists that are actually homophobic or queerphobic or sexphobic or dildophobic or drug phobic. There are therapists out there who are like that. It's hard to find
plenty. The problem, David, is that very rarely is any of this stuff talked about in training. So someone might train for 2 years, they might train for 7 years, and yet still they might have a day on working with LGBT, if that, or there may be only a day on trans, and that might be it for the entire course, and nothing on LGB, or very little, if ever, talked about drugs, never about kink. And so, and even if they're professional sex therapists who you'd think would get used to talking about sex, they're not really talking about our sexualities very much, and certainly not really rarely would they address chemsex. I mean, it's starting to happen in a couple of programs in Britain now, but in Europe, I don't think so.
There's a lot of people who have drug use careers, okay, whoever that might be, and many of them never see a therapist at all. Many of them live in drug services. Many never get to them. Some just find a very wealthy rehab, and they never experienced a one-to-one therapist like you, or a drug service, or a drugs worker, or a social worker. Can you tell me what therapy is and how it might fit into the care pathway of, say, a chemsex client?
I think essentially therapy is an intimate personal relationship, a professional relationship, where one person comes to do the talking, and the other person uses all of their knowledge and their heart and their soul to try to listen very attentively and help the person take apart some of the more challenging aspects of their lives and put together the pieces in a slightly different way. It's a bit like that beautiful Japanese art, I forget the name of it, where you take some pottery, you break it, and then you glue it all back together with gold. It becomes something else at the end. But therapy is this relationship, and it can take many years to do that. And so it just depends on what's being presented and how the person can make use of that relationship. And it's a challenge for some people. They may never have had anybody listen to them in quite that way, and sometimes fall in love with their therapist, because this is a person who is actually being like the best lover in the world, because they're incredibly attentive, they're very focused on them, they're very warm and understanding, and that's all the things that we get when we've got a lover. So sometimes these loving feelings can come into the room, and they need to be worked with in a professional manner too, because it's a one-sided, it is a one-sided professional relationship.
I think there's a lot of people who engage in chemsex who find it great, fulfilling and affirming and all these kinds of things. But a lot of people find chemsex or hookup experience to be a lot of lonely rejections and or incredible intimacies for a short amount of time, followed by being blocked. And it's and yes, many of them can find the kindness and the consistency and the boundary presented by a therapist to be all the dreams come true, very attractive, and it's very important to acknowledge the vulnerability there, I think. Yeah, I think so. It's a very special relationship. People are very vulnerable, and I get to hear things that maybe that person's never told anyone else in their lives. So that creates, I actually have a lot of power in that room, and an obligation to treat that person with tremendous care and respect because of what they've trusted in me. It would be very easy for somebody who hadn't had a very good training to use, manipulate, abuse that trust for their own ends. And I think this is one of the problems we can find when we've got peer volunteers working with people, is that the clients come in and they're maybe sexy and they're very attractive people and being quite seductive, and you feel like, well, I'm just here to help you, mate. It's all right, it's okay. And you've not had the kind of depth of training that tells you about professional boundaries and the importance of holding those professional boundaries. And then if the client starts being seductive, the therapist goes along with that, and then very quickly they're in a sexual relationship, which is just reinforcing a very negative pattern of abuse that the client will have experienced previously, because almost all of those highly seductive clients will come from a history of sexual abuse. It's just that maybe the worker hasn't yet got to take that history down, or that assessment down. I knew someone once, Dominic, who came on to me really, I would say aggressively, but he was really flirtatious, really sexy, overtly sexually available to me, and I needed quite strong boundaries to sort of say no. that was a long time ago. We're friends now. I now know that he is just a great guy who's at ease with his body, at ease with sex, at ease with company and love, and
Sure.
very safe and boundaried and respecting of other people's choices. And he's just very sex positive and brilliant. But I'm also aware that uh, prolific sexual availability is also a symptom of people who have experienced some kind of sexual trauma, like people who are abused as a child, sexually abused as a child, or people who have had some kind of psychosexual trauma in relation to the sex they have. And sometimes that can manifest as something that is very sexual available that looks very much like that sex positivity. And it's very hard for someone, for a drugs worker, a volunteer, or a peer worker to tell the difference that this person sitting in front of me is very vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Can you develop on that a little bit further?
Well, I think that's the case, and I think it's some people learn to use their sex appeal as a way of getting themselves taken care of, whether that's a bed for the night, whether that's a fix, whether that's or whether that's some extra time or an extra session or some extra contact with the therapist. And the therapist, our job is to try to hold some boundaries to reinforce our belief that they have the capacity to kind of take care of themselves in between sessions and look after themselves, rather than always giving into a kind of seduction. And maybe to surface this, I feel that maybe there's a bit of seduction going on at the moment, and that you're wanting more than I'm able to offer you. And these kinds of skills often don't even get taught to qualified psychologists and therapists, but they are really important with a highly sexualized population. To just be very respectful and not reject the person, not make them feel ashamed or bad, because as queer men, we've had plenty of experience of that, but to just kind of honor it, and just to say that isn't really what I'm here for or what I can do for you. Let's get back to talking about the story.
It might be that the drugs worker or the peer worker or the therapist might be the first person in this client's life that is authentic and listening and kind and showing them respect, not treating them like a sex object. A lot of people who their only self-esteem is as being sexy, and that's the only affirmation they've had for the previous decade, in and out of hookup life. I like that you talked about the trust that they're putting in us, even if it doesn't seem obvious.
So in terms of where does it fit in the pathway, I should probably go back to answering that bit of the question. I mean, I think firstly, it may be about helping somebody get stabilized in their drug use, so that they're not coming to sessions high, so that they, exactly. And that's a super important part, because it's really hard to access the deeper parts of one's emotional and psychological self if you're high, if you don't have a problem, if everything's great. So trying to time sessions, therapy sessions, once people have got stabilized, or in between highs. I mean, sessions on a Wednesday or Thursday may be the most therapeutic window to see chemsex clients, because on Tuesday they'll come down, and on Friday they'll be off using again. It's like, I mean, I've had colleagues who say, well, I won't work with anybody who's in active use. I just refuse to treat anybody that's impossible. If you're waiting for the window when they won't be using, you can't do that. I think we have to kind of think about collaborating and co-creating. When is the best time for me to see you? How can we try to maximize this opportunity that we get once for an hour, once a week? That's all it is, but you need to be sober enough to use it.
Well, can you explain why that is? Why does regular drug use interfere in the therapist's attempts to take someone upon a journey?
Well, if you're on the most massive come down possible, because you've not slept, or you've not eaten for the weekend, and your brain is kind of really depleted of all those gorgeous neurotransmitters, then the world is going to be the bleakest place possible, and it's really hard to find any possibility of joy or future. And if you come high, then everything's great and shiny and lovely, and you don't really want to sit down and talk about your problems, because what am I doing here? There's cock out there. I want it, So I think it's quite important that we just find those windows where people can come. And I've certainly had one or two clients turn up high during for a session, and we've realized, they've sat there and they've got, I can't really do this, can I? I said, no, I'll come against your guidelines, haven't I? Yeah, but you're paying me for this session. That's costing you money that you could have had, you could have used in better ways. And we are not able to do anything this week. So go away, come back next week, and we'll start again. It's fine. I've seen how it is when you're high, and you've seen how it is trying to talk about it when you're high.
And that's when a person like me, a drugs worker, can work in partnership with a therapist. Like sometimes a person might need to take a 3 or 4 week break from their therapy to get back on track and develop the skills. But
absolutely,
that's if they don't want to.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think it's so important that people get stabilized so that they can access therapy, because they're different works, they're different roles, and they're both equally important in that care pathway.
Is there a part of therapy that often happens when you have this awful realization that it's not the world's fault, it's me, it's what I'm doing, and you go through this period of self-loathing almost, and the therapist's job is to try to help you think kindly of yourself and be self-affirming during this period of self-realization, which can hurt so much, and having that interrupted by drug highs and drug come downs and things can be really unfair to the client?
I think very often the world tells us that we're mad, we're bad, we're dangerous to know in all kinds of ways, and those messages are reinforced all the time in society, and so we can internalize that stuff. I don't think people are bad, and I think it's that bad things have happened to us, and we're fed we're breathing air that's kind of perfumed or saturated with the stench of heteronormativity. I mean, there's big words, but that kind of those dominant ideas that make us feel like we're freaks or different or wrong. Well, we're not, and I think we need to locate the source of the problem, not in the individual, but in the outside world and the things that have been done to and said to the individual, and look at how that's impacted on them. Yeah.
There's many different kinds of therapy, more than I can even understand. I've Googled.
No, and me. And me.
Can you tell me, give a layman's version of all the different kinds of therapy there are, and if you can, are there some that are better suited for either chemsex clients or people who are engaging in drug use generally?
There are, I mean, it all started with Freud. It goes back to Freud, really, I guess. And so there are some models of therapy that focus a lot on childhood and early childhood trauma and the relationship with parents. And for many of our clients, that's actually a helpful framework to think about these early years. However, some people need to focus much more on the here and now, and they need to start with the here and now before they're ready to start looking at and acknowledging the stuff that's happened in the past. So things like person-centered therapy or Rogerian therapy, which is about just a therapeutic relationship with no magic answers and no advice. For some people, that can be very helpful. For other people, it can feel a bit too empty. Some people need structure, and they want some exercises and they want some homeworks. And so cognitive behavioral therapy might be a more useful approach for them, because there are these kinds of ways of looking at how you think about yourself and how you feel, and challenging those ideas and doing something with those thoughts and feelings. So then there's a kind of systemic therapy that's looking at the impact of society on the system of society, and the impact of the family on the individual. And so that can be useful, particularly with family relationships, trying to heal the rift between parents and the kid or the adult. If it can be repaired in that way, sometimes it can be useful. But there's there are other models. There's existential and phenomenological and all kinds of models. But it's not so much the model that's important, David. It's about the relationship with the individual. It's like, do I, as the client, feel like you, as my therapist, I can talk to you about anything? Can I bring all of my sexual fantasies and to explore what they mean to you? Can I feel that you won't judge me? Can I feel that you are warm, that you are trying your best to understand and support me? And if I feel that you can do that, then what nonsense you make of my world in your head hasn't really got much to do. It's like, it's this relationship that's the important bit. And I think that's supremely important. And all the research evidence into what's the most effective model to work with comes back to, it's the relationship that heals, not the model.
That is, thank you. So there are, as a drugs worker, I know that one of the most common reasons that people seek help with chemsex, for instance, it might be this confusing thing that happens to them where they might make a decision, I'm not going to use drugs this week, but they do. And they go, oh, well, I won't do them next week because there's an important thing happening. And then they do it. And they're thinking, what's wrong with me? I keep trying to make these choices and I keep failing my goals. There's something wrong with me, isn't there? Now, a drugs worker is trained. That's exactly what a drugs worker does, is help somebody sort of achieve goals. If someone's looking for a therapist, is that something that, is there such a thing as an addiction therapist? And is that different from another kind of therapist?
There are addiction therapists, so people who specialize just in working with people around drugs and substance misuse addictions. My understanding is that many of them adopt the kind of 12-step model of thinking about addictions. And so they're a bit, I guess it's a bit more specialist than you'd get if you went to an NA or an AA meeting, where you're sharing the time with the group. But I think, but the problem with addictions therapy is that they've often lumped in other addictions like food and porn and sex. And I don't think the evidence supports sex and porn as being addictions. Neurologically, I don't think the evidence supports that. And it's more likely to shame someone for normal things. And because these models come out of a kind of version of Christianity that puts the individual at fault and says that they're the sinner and that there's this higher power that's going to save them. Well, I think the individual is going to save themselves and they're not at fault. And sex is a great thing, and we need to be thinking about pleasure in our work with clients and the importance of sexual pleasure, as well as a more psychological, what else has happened in your life and how do we help you get back into control of it. And so it's about, maybe an addictions therapist will be of use, and certainly there are clinics that are set up to treat this. But for some people, that isn't the method. They need harm minimization or harm reduction strategies. They want to be kind of rooted in not giving it up, but doing it more carefully or sensibly. And they need to kind of have the social context of their lives taken account of. You can't expect somebody to become celibate for sex addiction for a year whilst they recover. It's unrealistic. It might be that for a while, and I think I saw Dr. Owen Jones talking about this the other day, say, let's just stop sex for a month or so whilst you get your brain regulated, because otherwise you're constantly using and getting high and it's just throwing everything out. We need time for the neurotransmitters to heal. So maybe a small period of abstinence is going to be useful, or certainly sex with others, and maybe your sex drive will come back. Maybe your erections will come back if you're not constantly sticking a needle of meth in your arm. But it's important that we take account of the context of people's lives. And if you're not going to be doing sex, then let's make sure that there's enough support in your life, that there are friends around, there are people there to give you a hug when you want it, to cuddle up and watch a Netflix, to kind of have the sociability that you might have got from going to a chill out. Although most of my clients tell me chill outs are not very social, and the people are just sitting on their phones feeling quite isolated, living in the world out there. So, it varies, mileage varies, doesn't it?
You mentioned the 12 steps, and you mentioned people suggesting taking a break from sex or stopping having sex. And a lot of the, I think you're talking about, it all comes down to choice. I think what a good therapist does and a good drugs worker does is always work with the goals of the person.
Yes.
And there are some services where the goals are preset for you, and that, like the 12 steps are amazing for people who don't know what the 12 steps are, like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. They're peer groups of peers, of people who have shared experience with that drug or alcohol. And they do subscribe to it being part of the group is about having a goal of never using again. And some people really need that very strict dogma. Some people have been really burnt and hurt by their addictions and their own relationship with drugs is quite traumatic. And I've met people who really do struggle to learn basic craving management skills and to manage.
Absolutely.
And sometimes a very strict dogma, a very strict dogma, I think, in a very strict goal.
It's been life-saving for many people, absolutely life-saving for many people.
But I have to say, as therapists, and I count myself as one, although I'm not qualified in your kind of league, drugs workers, I mean, our job is to listen and work with whatever goals with the person sitting in front of us, just like, and that might be sometimes having a break from sex is the best thing to do because it will trigger you. And one of the main reasons that you keep on relapsing when that might not be your goal is because the sex is triggering you. But when someone suggests stopping something for good, when someone suggests you must subscribe to this philosophy or you will die, when someone says, do as I say, you are wrong, that's the opposite of that kind of therapy.
It's absolutely. I think we have to be led by the client's goals. What's going to work for you? And what do you want to achieve? And how can we help you achieve that?
That brings us some problems too, because a lot of, I think the one thing that makes a difference between your job and my job is I think therapists work with people who have been assessed as ready to make changes, assessed as I've identified something I want to work towards. And if you don't get through that assessment with I'm here because I want to, I know what I want to work towards and I'm ready for this journey, then they might sometimes not necessarily assessed as being ready for that journey. When they do come back to the drugs worker is sitting usually in front of someone who does not want to be there, is ambivalent, in denial, having different attitudes through the course of a day or a week about whether they want to make change or not. And all of that frustration and anger is sitting right in front of us. So I know that that's something that defines our roles differently in a great big way. And
for sure. In a way, I have it easier than the drugs worker does.
In a way, but we have very, very strict focus. So when people want to talk to us about I'm doing my drugs because of what happened to me as a child, because I hate my body, and if you find me a good therapist, it will fix all those things, my drug problem will go away. And our job is kind of very focused on today, you're telling me that you want to not use drugs for the next week. My job is just that. On Saturday night, you'll feel differently. And my job is to help you reconcile how you feel on Saturday night and how you feel today with me now, because that is what defines your problem, is that you achieving goals and having different moods about it and being ambivalent and having different chemistry working differently in your brain when you're having a craving and you can't access logic or reason or goal focus or cognition. And I think you've got a complicated job of dealing with the trauma of the stuff that people bring to you. And our job is putting the trauma aside for later for you and just working on the goal ahead of us and achieving that.
Yeah. And I realize that sometimes people come to see me and they've not seen a drugs worker first, and we start the work and they drop out. And they're not ready yet for it. They think they're ready, and they don't even know that drugs workers exist and can help stabilize them in this period. And they drop out, and then they might represent a little bit later and come back and we work some more. And I think that's absolutely fine. It's like people are going to do their journey in the best way they know how. And I think we have to try to do our best to help them with that process, really.
I see a lot of people I do see a lot of people who could come, who have a 10-year journey of in and out of support and in and out of support. People who slammed my door because my boundaries were too strict for them, or because they're having a difficult week, or because I was a bad worker perhaps. But they come back. And I think the journey that a therapist or a drugs worker plays in someone's life, even if it's a bad session this month and a good one the year after and a bad one the year after, that is the nature of drugs work. I think I've heard an expression, there were people say people who use drugs, they love their therapist, but they hate the drugs worker. And I think that's I think drug workers get more slammed doors in our face than therapists do.
They've got the sharp end of it, I think. Yeah, they have got the sharp end of it. And not all therapists have a good session all the time, and not our job isn't necessarily to make someone leave the session feeling happy. Our job is to help them explore what it is at the time, and sometimes people will feel worse after a session and not want to come back the next week. And it's about how we motivate ourselves to return, because this work has taken a long time for that person's life to get fucked up. Yeah. And it's going to take a while for it to be fixed or resolved or put back together in a more manageable way. Yeah.
In your experience, and you've seen many Chemsex clients, I know. So in your experience, what are the most common associations between the Chemsex and what brings them to therapy? Whether it's this Chemsex caused this trauma, or whether the Chemsex is causing some kind of thing that needs therapy?
I think one of the most common things that I've seen has been a history of trauma. So whether that trauma was child sexual abuse, whether it was bullying. I mean, there's this study called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Events study. It's a big piece of research project, and you can answer 10 questions and get a score. People who have higher ACE scores are much more likely to have physical health problems later on in life, shortened life, and psychological problems. And certainly I use the ACE questionnaire with most of my clients, and that gives us an indication. Oh wow, it's a very rapid wave. So these things happened. That's going to account for some of why you're like you are. Bullying at school. Lots of young queers get bullied at school. It might be they move to London, and then there's the isolation. They've come away from the bullying and the rejection and the parental stuff. They're now feeling lonely. They're feeling isolated. And the only way that people seem to be able to connect, or they've realized to connect, is through sex. And that gives them an immediate validation. And then when they get offered drugs and sex, and drugs make it all so much better, then it's like, oh, well, why would I not want to do? And it's a very seductive kind of pattern to have that intimacy. But people are often very lonely. I've seen, as a sex therapist, I've seen a pattern that a lot of clients come in using drugs as a way of managing their psychosexual difficulties. Particularly, it's a great way for dealing with rapid ejaculation. It's an almost perfect treatment plan for rapid ejaculation, because it makes it very hard to come when high. So then they don't feel that they're failed by shooting their load in the first 30 seconds of a meet. But then that might just leave them horny, and so they don't keep using, and then they can't come, and then they still stay horny, and it just becomes this cycle. It's like difficult to work with. They don't even know that there's a treatment. There are many treatments, psychological treatments for rapid ejaculation. Let's just treat that, and maybe you'll be able to have sex without drugs and feel in control of your self-esteem and your load.
In your load. There's so many things like that come up in therapy with a Chemsex client. Things we talk about. Testing, sex, high, intoxication, fantasies that might be quite florid, shame, or even I might have someone who might have unwittingly been responsible for not respecting someone else's consent in a Chemsex environment, and they want to take that to the therapist. So there are a lot of therapists out there that, fair enough, are going to be a little, I don't want to say outraged, a little frightened by some of the stuff, or not prepared.
Quite disturbing. Yeah, some of this stuff is quite disturbing for a therapist, particularly one who's not had any training around this area, to be listening to. As you say, violation of someone's consent, basically having sex with someone while they're unconscious on G, watching some really intense porn that they hadn't put on, but there was some stuff going on the screen that left them feeling really bad about what happened. being with somebody who's in a chemsex psychosis, in a crystal meth psychosis, and frightened and putting a knife on them, paranoid, being videoed covertly while they're having sex, and putting on a show while they're being drugged. Like, some really crazy stuff can go on if the therapists aren't kind of pre-warned about some of this, and have a chance to look at their own reactions to it and their own feelings of wanting to rescue people or to make it all right or to overcompensate. Like, we need to kind of get our shit together before we're sitting in front of clients, bringing this very florid and exciting and exotic material that we couldn't have even imagined people did. Yeah.
Do you have some, well, I know that therapists have clinical supervision. I know not a lot of drugs workers or nurses get that in big amounts that they deserve either, but I know that there are therapists out there who are going to don't even like talking about gay sex. And fair enough, it's not, I don't really want to force every single human being in the world to be able to be comfortable with talking about that or the extremities of it sometimes. But I do want them to know that that's what clinical supervision is for, and it's what experts like me and yourself are for, to reach out. If it's okay to feel uncomfortable, you can do this better than me. What's your advice?
Sure. Well, I think therapists need supervisors that they can take whatever it is about their own feelings about the client, whatever it is about maybe some of their own personal lives, their own, if they're gay too and they're living in and swimming in this context. We need to be able to look at how we manage with that. We might come back onto that in a moment. And they need supervisors who can kind of hold them and be culturally familiar as they are. And if they haven't got that, then it needs to be sought out from other experienced people, even if it's just one-off consultations. I get quite a lot of one-off consultations from cisgender straight therapists who are saying, this client's telling me this, is that normal? What can you tell me more about that? And I become a bit of a human library for them. But I think there is also some of that. How do we train therapists to work in this area so that they're not going to be too shocked? And I think this is, you've had an involvement in that video Geo Clock, which I think opens up a kind of discussion about, this is what a chill out looks like, people. This is how people might be behaving. This is how things might get out of hand. It's cultural sensitivity in a little video. I think that is a really good example of training tools, videos on, diverse and extreme sexual practices, so that they know what fisting looks like, and that they can they understand some more of this kind of thing, so that they're just a bit more prepared for it and they're not shocked.
Yeah, because it should be the client's trauma and not the therapist, I guess, in the room. Trauma is a big part of this, and I think a lot of people I know they're having a lot of trauma on Monday and Tuesday. Memories of, you mentioned some of the greater ones that I know you and I hear all the time. So having 3 days of porn imagery sort of upon you, some of it quite extreme, not your own choice, sometimes even worse in extreme situations. And but it's not just that, it's also the paranoia that it's much more common than people think. And just because you're going to a chemsex party or a chemsex environment, and just because it looks like everyone's having fun there, many of them are traumatized on the Tuesday too. And when that builds up, and I'm thinking of like 10 years of rejection. Think of 10 years of every time you go to your computer to have a wank, it's associated with lots of rejections and abuse and consent and drug high and poor relationship to sober sex and intimacy. And every time you just want to have a wank, part of that is in the psychology of what's happening with you. And then just 24 hours in paranoia can be like a year at war. It's such an awful thing. For some people, they're experiencing that every single week. So there's kind of an accumulated trauma, as well as stuff from the pre-existed chemsex, like the Asian guy who is at the front of the Pride Parade, and we adore him. He's camp and fabulous. He's got big feathers on, and he minces down the street, and the whole world likes him. Even the straight world are waving flags and they love him there. But he gets rejected racially and awfully for being too femme and too Asian or on Grindr.
Right, yeah.
By his own community. So there's so much trauma that gets packed into the Chemsex environment that ends up sitting in front of you or me.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about what trauma does, or anything using something.
Well, it just eats at the soul, really. I think that's the kind of the easiest way to describe it. It just reinforces a tremendous sense of shame, of unworthiness. And it's something that's done to us rather than something that we've sought out. We get traumatized by external experiences and events. And we need to sometimes have a space to kind of try to just step back from that. But in talking about the trauma, sometimes it can be very re-traumatizing. And so I think it's important that before we leap into talking about a traumatic experience that we've had, which would be the equivalent of putting your foot on the accelerator, let's get in there, let's talk about it. First of all, let's just look around and find where the brake is. Let's just find where the gear stick is. Let's just learn to, mirror signal maneuver. Let's just calm it down. Because before we get into talking about foot on the gas, if we get out of control, if we start to feel re-traumatized in this, as a therapist, what am I going to see? How am I going to know that this is really hard for you? How can I help you put your foot on the brake? Or what can we agree as a process of just putting a foot on the brake, slowing down, changing down the gear, checking around for things that might be getting in the way of us doing this work, so that you can do it in a calm and less traumatic way. So I think trauma-informed therapy is super important around chemsex, and not every therapist, particularly in their basic training, gets trauma training. It tends to be stuff that happens after you've had your basic training.
As a drugs worker, I never got it either, and I learned the awful way.
Yeah.
Talking about it with people who, and then they would, just because we discussed it, it was on their mind in the hours and days after, and it triggered more dangerous drug use.
Yes.
Way how to not talk about things. So I think people think of trauma as the traumatized person will sit in front of you sort of vulnerable and a bit crying and a bit self-aware that there is some trauma there. It doesn't look like that. It looks like calluses. It looks like prickliness. It looks like sexual overtness. It looks like sex positivity. It looks like someone's flirting with you or fighting with you or telling you they're fine. It's hard to sometimes.
It can be bitchiness about everybody else, and it's not about them. It can be putting you down for your skills, as a way of trying to put some distance between you and them. You're useless. My last therapist was so much better than you. Or my friend tells me you're just terrible. Is that the best you can do?
Why didn't you fix my addiction? Why didn't you fix me?
Yeah.
But of course, we're always very compassionate when these things happen. These are normal things, and fighting with oneself is a normal part of one's relationship with a therapist too. I do know that
people are hurting.
Being a drugs worker's job, I don't know if this is the same for a therapist, is not to become complicit in an ongoing cycle of use as well. So sometimes a drugs worker might have boundaries about, if you want to engage with me, we have to have these goals or that. And there are so many people who, a part of their brain is saying, I don't want to stop doing drugs. But the cognitive part of the brain is saying, I want to make changes, but there's a more powerful, almost Darwinian part of the brain that's compelling them to use. And they're using all of their resources and manipulative powers and reason and coercion to be able to sort of stay in your chair, but not do the changes. And it's a fight with oneself. And a drugs worker has to be very careful not to not become a complicit ongoing cycle by being too lax in boundaries and things like that. Is that ringing any bells for what you do in therapy?
Yes, I think so. I think I think for me, the training that I've had in kind of neuroscience had kind of helped me understand what's going on there. And so there's a whole kind of dopamine surge coming, isn't there? And we see this, we've seen this in videos of little kids being offered a marshmallow. You have to defer your gratification, that marshmallow exercise with kids, and a box of chocolates. Can we eat one, or are we going to just have to? I'm one of those people who can usually just take one chocolate and stop, but many people can't, and I think that's maybe why managed not to get caught up in a whole chemsex chaos because I'm too controlling and I'm too controlled. I'm too frightened of getting out of control.
If it's fear, that's one thing. But where did you learn that thing to delay the gratification, to have a long-term focus on, I don't want to eat all the chocolates now because I've got another goal that's more important? Where did you learn that?
I think I learned it as a kid, really, about things like Christmas. I remember one time I went down ahead of my parents waking up with my brother, and we opened all of our Christmas presents that were downstairs. And then my parents got up and heard us and came down, and they were absolutely devastated. And it's like they wanted to give it to us and to see our faces. I had no understanding as a little 7-year-old that this was what was expected. And actually, I didn't really have anything to do for the rest of the day because they were just all there. And so I've learned that there's something about holding off. If someone gives you if I get a birthday card or a birthday present and it's not my birthday yet, I wait for the time, because there's something about, I wonder what it is. I enjoy that sense of mystery and excitement.
You learned that as a young person. I see a pattern here, because a person's making a decision. I want to do drugs now. I feel awful. I'm bored. I'm horny and I'm lonely. Everyone else is having fun. I'm having a rush of dopamine and I want it now. I don't care about tomorrow. I don't care that I've got no money.
Yeah.
My mum's getting married on Saturday. I want it now. And I can see that the people who learned goal focus and how to sacrifice an immediate reward for a longer term goal, and when they learned it as children, when it was modeled for them, or when they were able to cognitively learn those skills as a younger person. But there are a lot of gay people out there who weren't feeling parented because of their gayness in the family home. Vigilant about being bullied or rejected, that they were not learning the normal lessons that a lot of people learn, which is why I think we have higher disproportionate drug use amongst gay people. What do you think?
Well, and we have a very now society, don't we? Everything's very instant. We're not encouraged to wait, and we want it fast. We want it the fastest. We want it the best, and we want it right now. And I think it's a generational thing for me. Like, I learned some of this stuff. I had my fair share of childhood trauma, but that was one of the ways in which I learned about delayed gratification. But if I were growing up in society now and I'm just coming out, I would be in there and having it all. And I think to my detriment.
Patience is sex is also another thing where patience is required. I think sometimes some of us can just stick our penis in anything warm and feel pleasure, and we're not thinking about, does my bum look big in this, or fearing rejection or being self-conscious. But a lot of us are, but we're kind of required to get on that treadmill of hookup life and immediate sex and being sexy and being confident and delivering performances. I think there's a lot of reparenting, I think, is that the word we're talking about here, when some people didn't learn skills that were better learned as children that help you be functioning adults that can control the choices around drugs rather than lose control. Is reparenting in regard to understanding how sex fits into our life, goal focus, part of therapy?
I think reparenting can occur within the relationship between the therapist and the client, because to some extent we might become the benign or positive parent that they maybe didn't get. I think it can happen in terms of using this concept of the inner child, that inside of us we've got a number of younger children, and so at various points we might try to encourage a dialogue between the adult in front of us, getting them to have an internal dialogue with their inner child. What does the child want right now? Is it appropriate to be taking this 7-year-old out to a chemsex party at the weekend, and expose them to all of this stuff? It's so inner child work as part of them parenting themselves can be useful. And things like mindfulness and meditation, helping people learn just to kind of calm the brain so that new neural pathways can grow. It can be very difficult to engage with that kind of thing, but the evidence is, if you just start slow and small, that people are able to do it in one way or another. and that helps with this delayed gratification and surge, surfing the urge to do something, and just kind of finding ways of self-soothing and calming themselves, or distracting themselves from things, so that they can sit with it for a bit or distract themselves with it for a bit. The urge usually passes after a while. It's there, it's immediate, it must be fed, but actually in half an hour, do you still want to do that? If you've used some of the kind of those techniques, maybe I can wait a bit longer.
I do think that's one of the most important things. One of the things that your profession and mine share the most. Managing mood is really the solution to craving management and relapse prevention, and control over your choices. We're coming up to an hour, so I guess I should ask you my final question, which is, in all of your work with Chemsex clients, you must have developed a very loving and protective sentiment towards your homo community. I know you have. We talk about this so much during our breakfast. Do you want to finish with any musings or summaries of the experience of being a sexually active gay man in a big city in modern times?
I think one of the things that I hear from some of my supervisees is who are gay men, who is a fear of cruising, of going online, of pursuing an active, independent sex life, because they feel like their colleagues or their clients, that that it's all going to get out of control. They may be shamed for it or whatever. And I think it's really important that we claim our right to be sexually active human beings in consensual ways that make sense for us. And we can also be professional therapists that hold professional boundaries to treat that sacred space that exists, and that sacred trust that exists between us and our clients, as being a perfect place to do the work that we feel called to do. Now, I'm using kind of religious metaphors there, and I'm not at all a religious man, but I feel it's like that. We have an obligation to do our best for our clients and for ourselves. And if we're not getting those sexual and emotional needs met in a healthy way, then I think the likelihood is that we may well slip up and look to our clients for our intimacy needs. And that is really dangerous. And so we need to be mindful of that.
That is beautiful. Thank you very much for the
Is that all right?
Integrity. Yeah, more than all right. This is the you I know, always kind and full of integrity and kindness for your profession and your work and your service. Thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.